The metallic groan of the hangar doors echoed across the Pacific airfield as morning light sliced through the humid air, illuminating the captured Japanese bomber sitting like a wounded predator on the concrete. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes felt sweat bead on his forehead, though whether from the tropical heat or the weight of what lay ahead, he could not say. The Mitsubishi G4M medium bomber loomed before the assembled American pilots and engineers, its sleek silhouette simultaneously elegant and menacing. Hayes had shot down 2 of these aircraft over the Solomon Islands, watching them explode into fireballs so spectacular that his squadron mates had nicknamed them flying lighters. Now, standing beside the intact fuselage with a wrench in his hand and authorization to dismantle every rivet, he was about to discover why Japanese aircrew flew these machines into combat, knowing they were sitting on a powder keg. The smell of aviation fuel hung in the air, mixing with salt spray from the nearby ocean, and somewhere behind him a camera clicked as intelligence officers documented what would become one of the most shocking revelations of the Pacific Air War. The captured G4M had arrived 3 days earlier, hauled onto an American transport after a forced landing on a contested island airstrip. The pilot, severely wounded, had survived long enough to be questioned before succumbing to his injuries. His final words, translated by a Nisei interpreter, had been simple and haunting. "Tell your pilots we knew." The bomber bore the scars of combat, bullet holes stitched across its aluminum skin, but the damage was superficial enough that the aircraft remained structurally sound. Hayes and his team had been given a singular mission: understand this aircraft completely, identify its vulnerabilities, and determine why it burned so readily when hit. The Navy wanted tactical intelligence that could save American lives, and every hour spent with this captured prize might translate into dozens of enemy bombers destroyed with minimal expenditure of ammunition. As Hayes approached the forward fuselage section, notebook in hand, he noticed something odd about the bomber's construction. The panels seemed thinner than expected, almost fragile, and when he rapped his knuckles against the metal, the sound echoed hollow and insubstantial. Opening the access panel beneath the wing root revealed the first shock. Fuel lines, thick as a man's thumb, ran exposed along the interior fuselage walls with no protective covering, no shielding, nothing but bare metal tubing carrying hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. Hayes stared in disbelief, his hand instinctively reaching out to trace the tubing before pulling back as if burned. Every aircraft he had ever flown or examined incorporated some form of fuel system protection. Self-sealing tanks surrounded by layers of rubber and fabric that would swell and close when punctured, or at minimum, armored conduits that routed fuel lines through protected channels away from potential combat damage. Here, the fuel system lay completely naked, vulnerable to even the smallest fragment of shrapnel or the most glancing machine gun round. Chief Petty Officer James Morrison, a veteran aircraft mechanic who had served on carriers since before Pearl Harbor, leaned in beside Hayes and let out a low whistle. He had seen Japanese aircraft before, examined wreckage pulled from crash sites and ocean surfaces, but never had he witnessed such a comprehensive abandonment of basic survivability principles. The fuel lines were not even routed along the structural members, where they might have gained incidental protection from the airframe itself. The tanks themselves proved equally alarming. Constructed from thin aluminum without self-sealing capability, they occupied enormous volumes within the wings and fuselage, prioritizing range over protection in a calculation that seemed almost suicidal to the American observers. Morrison estimated that a single incendiary round penetrating any of these tanks would ignite the fuel vapor inside, and the resulting fireball would consume the entire aircraft in seconds. Hayes thought of the G4Ms he had engaged in combat, remembering how they had transformed from flying machines into falling torches almost instantaneously when his .50 caliber rounds found their mark. He had assumed the Japanese used particularly volatile fuel, or that some secondary ammunition explosion contributed to the spectacular destruction. Now, examining the exposed plumbing and unprotected tanks, he understood the terrible truth. These bombers were designed to burn. The realization settled over the hangar like a shroud. And someone behind Hayes muttered a curse that echoed the thoughts of everyone present. How could any Air Force, even one as fanatical as Japan's, send men into combat in machines built with such flagrant disregard for crew survival? The investigation continued throughout the day, each new discovery adding layers to an emerging portrait of engineering philosophy utterly alien to American thinking. The G4M possessed extraordinary range, capable of flying over 2,000 miles without refueling, a capability achieved through massive fuel capacity and aerodynamic efficiency. But that range came at a cost, calculated in blood. The aircraft carried no armor plating for the crew, no bulletproof glass for the pilots, no protective barriers between the fuel tanks and the fuselage interior, where 7 men sat surrounded by aviation gasoline. Even the defensive armament, while numerous, was mounted in positions that offered little protection for the gunners themselves. Hayes opened the tail gunner's compartment and found a cramped space barely large enough for a seated man, with a 20mm cannon protruding through a thin aluminum fairing that would stop nothing larger than a pistol round. The gunner would sit here, thousands of feet above the ocean, surrounded by fuel tanks, with enemy fighters approaching from astern, and only a sheet of metal thinner than a car door between him and eternity. The psychological weight of such vulnerability seemed incomprehensible. Lieutenant Robert Chen, a technical intelligence officer fluent in Japanese, had been translating captured maintenance manuals and operational documents recovered from the aircraft. His findings added context to the physical evidence. This doctrine emphasized offensive capability above all else, a philosophy rooted in the samurai tradition that viewed defensive preparations as cowardice and dishonor. The G4M, designated the Type 1 attack bomber by the Imperial Navy, embodied this ethos completely. It could strike targets far beyond the range of any comparable American bomber, could carry a respectable payload of bombs or torpedoes, could cruise at speeds that made interception challenging, but it could not survive battle damage. Chen read aloud from a pilot's manual that included a section on emergency procedures in case of fire. The instructions were brief and fatalistic, essentially advising crew to bail out immediately if flames were observed, as fire suppression was considered futile. There was no mention of fire extinguishers, no discussion of damage control procedures, nothing but acceptance that a burning G4M was a dying G4M. The manual's tone was matter-of-fact, almost serene, as if the writers had made peace with the bomber's vulnerability before the first aircraft ever left the factory. The revelation sparked intense debate among the American officers present. Some argued that the Japanese simply lacked the industrial capacity to produce the sophisticated self-sealing fuel systems and armor plating that American aircraft employed as standard equipment. Japan's economy, strained by years of war in China and now engaged in total conflict across the Pacific, might simply be unable to afford protective measures that added weight and complexity. But others, Chen among them, suggested the explanation went deeper than mere resource constraints. Japanese military culture, forged in centuries of warrior tradition, genuinely believed that spiritual strength and offensive aggression trumped defensive preparation. To armor an aircraft was to admit fear of death, to doubt the righteousness of the cause, to dishonor the samurai code that demanded warriors face mortality without flinching. The G4M's design might be less a failure of engineering and more a success of ideology, a conscious choice to sacrifice protection for performance, to trade crew survival for operational range, to embrace death as the price of striking the enemy. Hayes found this explanation simultaneously fascinating and horrifying, a window into a mindset so fundamentally different from his own that bridging the gap seemed impossible. As twilight approached, the team moved to the bomber's cockpit, where the pilot and co-pilot would have sat during the long missions over the Pacific. The seats offered no armor backing, the instrument panel no protective shield, the canopy no bulletproof transparency. Hayes settled into the pilot's position, his hands finding the control yoke, his feet reaching for the rudder pedals. From here, Japanese pilots had flown missions lasting 8-10 10, 12 hours, navigating by dead reckoning across featureless ocean, searching for American carriers that could appear as tiny specks on the horizon or not at all. They had pressed home attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, had felt their aircraft shudder under the impact of fighter guns, had watched fuel gauges drop toward empty on the return journey with no guarantee of finding their bases again. And they had done it all sitting unprotected in a machine that would incinerate them the moment enemy fire found the fuel tanks. The courage required seemed almost incomprehensible, yet Hayes knew that Japanese bomber crews had demonstrated that courage repeatedly, attacking despite appalling losses, pressing on until their aircraft were shot from the sky or their fuel exhausted. Morrison discovered another unsettling feature while examining the wing structure. The G4M utilized unusually thin aluminum skin to save weight, so thin that he could actually dent it with firm thumb pressure. The entire airframe was built to a standard that prioritized lightness above robustness, accepting fragility as the cost of range. Combined with the unprotected fuel system, this meant that even rifle-caliber bullets could potentially cause catastrophic damage. Hayes recalled combat reports from other pilots who claimed to have downed G4Ms with relatively few hits, sometimes seeing the bombers explode after what seemed like minor damage. Those reports had been met with skepticism, dismissed as exaggeration or lucky hits on bombs or ammunition. Now the evidence lay before them. These aircraft were genuinely that vulnerable. A single burst from a Wildcat's guns, if properly aimed, could doom a G4M and its entire crew. The bomber's own ammunition, stored in unprotected bins throughout the fuselage, added to the danger. Any hit near these storage areas could trigger secondary explosions that would rip the aircraft apart from within. It was a cascade of vulnerabilities, each reinforcing the others, creating a machine that was simultaneously deadly to its enemies and suicidal for its crew. The question that haunted Hayes and his colleagues through the evening was not why the G4M was vulnerable, but why Japanese pilots continued flying it after its weaknesses became apparent. The aircraft had entered service in 1941, and by 1943, its reputation as a flying lighter was well established on both sides. Yet Japanese bomber squadrons continued missions in these aircraft, continued pressing attacks, continued dying in flames. Chen suggested that the Japanese military simply had no better alternative. Developing a new bomber would take years, require resources Japan no longer possessed, and demand retooling factories already struggling to meet production quotas. The G4M, for all its flaws, was available in quantity, familiar to crews and maintainers, and capable of performing its mission if crews accepted the risks. Beyond practicality lay the psychological dimension. Admitting the aircraft was fundamentally flawed would mean acknowledging that Japanese engineering had failed, that the enemy possessed superior design philosophy, that thousands of airmen had died in machines their own nation knew were death traps. Such admissions were impossible within the rigid hierarchy and face-saving culture of Imperial Japan. Better to continue fighting with inadequate tools than to confess inadequacy. Night fell over the airfield, but the examination continued under worklights that cast harsh shadows across the bomber's interior. Hayes found himself in the radio operator's compartment, a cramped space amidships where a single crewman would have sat, surrounded by communication equipment and, inevitably, fuel tanks. The radio operator had no means of escape if the aircraft caught fire. No clear path to any exit, no parachute storage within reach. His survival depended entirely on the pilot's ability to keep the aircraft intact and the enemy's failure to find the fuel tanks. Hayes tried to imagine the mental state required to occupy this position mission after mission, to strap into this metal coffin knowing that fire meant certain death, that every enemy fighter represented not just danger but likely annihilation. Japanese military training emphasized acceptance of death, taught that life belonged to the emperor, and death in service was the highest honor. But surely, Hayes thought, even the most thoroughly indoctrinated warrior must feel fear in this position, must fight the instinct to refuse such missions, must struggle with the knowledge that survival depended more on luck than skill or courage. Morrison had been calculating fuel capacity and comparing it to known G4M operational data. His findings suggested that on maximum range missions, the bomber would carry so much fuel that the aircraft was essentially a flying gas tank with engines and crew attached. The fuel-to-airframe weight ratio approached levels that American designers would consider insane, with combustible liquid comprising more than half the aircraft's total loaded weight. This explained the extraordinary range, but also illuminated why combat damage was so invariably fatal. There was simply too much fuel, too widely distributed, too poorly protected for any reasonable expectation of surviving battle damage. A single tracer round penetrating the wing could ignite fuel vapor that would propagate through interconnected tanks, turning the entire aircraft into a fireball within seconds. The self-sealing tanks used on American aircraft could handle minor punctures, and even when holed, the rubber lining would swell and plug the leak before significant fuel was lost. The G4M's bare aluminum tanks offered no such protection. Once holed, they leaked freely, fuel spraying into the airstream where any spark would ignite it. The resulting fire would be fed by the very wind of the aircraft's passage, turning the bomber into a torch that no crew could hope to extinguish. Chen had been interviewing American fighter pilots whose gun camera footage showed G4M kills, asking them to describe exactly what happened when their fire struck these bombers. The accounts were remarkably consistent. The initial hits would produce small flashes as rounds punched through aluminum skin. Then, within seconds, sometimes almost instantaneously, the bomber would erupt into a massive fireball that consumed the entire aircraft. Pilots reported that the explosions were so violent that they had to break away quickly to avoid debris or the shockwave. Some described seeing crew members attempting to bail out, silhouettes visible against the flames for a moment before being consumed. Others reported that the bombers simply disintegrated, structural failure following so quickly after ignition that the aircraft came apart in mid-air, pieces tumbling earthward trailing smoke and flame. The luckiest G4M crews were those hit near the tail, where there was a slim chance the fire might remain localized long enough for survivors to escape. But hits anywhere near the wings or fuselage fuel tanks meant instant death for everyone aboard. Hayes listened to these accounts and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and pity. As a fighter pilot, he was pleased to know that his weapons were so effective against this enemy bomber. As a fellow aviator, he felt a troubling empathy for men who went to war in machines their own government knew were inadequate. The technical examination revealed other compromises that seemed penny-wise and pound-foolish. The G4M's electrical system was minimally redundant, meaning a single hit in the wrong place could disable multiple systems simultaneously. The hydraulics, which controlled landing gear and flaps, ran through exposed lines as vulnerable as the fuel system. Even the control cables, which connected the pilot's yoke to the control surfaces, were routed in paths that made them susceptible to battle damage. American aircraft designers had learned through painful experience to incorporate redundancy and protection into these critical systems, to route cables and lines through protected areas, to provide backup systems that could function even after primary systems failed. The G4M incorporated almost none of these lessons. It was as if the designers had asked themselves how to build the longest-range bomber possible and then stopped thinking once that goal was achieved, never considering what would happen when enemy fire started hitting that carefully optimized airframe. Morrison suggested that perhaps Japanese designers had simply underestimated how much combat damage aircraft would need to withstand, that they had planned for a short war where bomber losses would remain acceptable. But by 1943, when this aircraft was built, Japan had been at war for years and had lost hundreds of G4Ms to combat. The lessons should have been learned, yet here was proof that nothing had changed. Hayes spent an hour in the bomb bay, examining how weapons were carried and released. Even here, vulnerability was evident. The bombs hung on simple racks with no protective covers, fully exposed to any gunfire that penetrated the thin belly skin. A hit on the bombs themselves could detonate them, destroying the aircraft instantly. American bombers carried their ordnance in enclosed bays with armored doors that offered at least some protection. The G4M's bomb bay was simply a space in the fuselage where weapons were loaded through doors that remained closed only during flight. Morrison pointed out that the bay's location, directly adjacent to the main fuselage fuel tanks, created yet another vulnerability. A bomb hit could ignite fuel, or a fuel fire could detonate bombs. The designers had seemingly gone out of their way to cluster all the aircraft's most dangerous components into the smallest possible space, maximizing the chance that any hit would cause catastrophic damage. It was the opposite of survivability engineering, a masterclass in how not to design a combat aircraft. Yet the G4M had been produced in the thousands, had equipped dozens of squadrons, had been entrusted with some of the Imperial Navy's most important missions. The disconnect between the aircraft's obvious flaws and its continued use baffled the American observers. As midnight approached, Chen shared perhaps the most disturbing document he had found, a letter from a G4M pilot to his family, recovered from the aircraft's wreckage. Written weeks before the forced landing, the letter spoke calmly about the pilot's certainty that he would not survive the war, his acceptance of death as inevitable given the aircraft he flew and the missions he flew it on. He wrote about his pride in serving the emperor, his confidence that his death would have meaning, his hope that Japan would triumph even as he fell. But beneath the formal language and patriotic sentiments, Chen detected what he interpreted as resignation, almost fatalism. The pilot knew he flew a flawed aircraft. He knew his chances of survival were minimal. He continued anyway because duty demanded it, because honor required it, because refusing was unthinkable within the culture that shaped him. To Hayes, this seemed the saddest revelation of all, not that the G4M was vulnerable, but that its crews knew they were vulnerable and flew anyway, trapped between their aircraft's inadequacies and their culture's demands. American pilots, at least, had the comfort of knowing their nation equipped them with the best tools available and prioritized their survival. Japanese bomber crews had neither comfort. The examination concluded near dawn, as early light began filtering through the hangar's high windows, and the team compiled their findings into formal reports. The G4M's vulnerabilities would be documented in tactical bulletins distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet, informing fighter pilots exactly where to aim for maximum effectiveness. The exposed fuel lines, the thin skin, the unprotected tanks, all would become targets of opportunity, known weak points that could be exploited to down these bombers with minimum ammunition expenditure. Hayes knew that the intelligence his team had gathered would save American lives, would increase the kill ratio in aerial combat, would hasten Japan's defeat. Yet he felt no triumph, only a weary sadness. The G4M represented a profound failure, not just of engineering, but of military philosophy, a failure that had been paid for in the lives of thousands of young men who deserved better from the nation they served. He thought of the pilot whose letter Chen had translated, imagined him sitting in this very cockpit, preparing for a mission he knew might be his last, accepting vulnerability as the price of duty. That kind of courage, misguided as it might be, commanded respect, even as the aircraft that demanded it commanded contempt. Morrison lingered by the fuel tanks, shaking his head in disbelief. He had seen many aircraft in his career, had watched aviation technology evolve from canvas and wood biplanes to sleek metal monoplanes, had witnessed the transformation of military aviation from a marginal capability to the war's decisive element. But never had he encountered a design that so thoroughly sacrificed crew protection for performance, that so explicitly valued mission capability over human survival. American aircraft designers sweated every pound of weight, constantly seeking ways to improve performance, but they did so within boundaries defined by acceptable survivability. The G4M's designers appeared to have acknowledged no such boundaries, accepting any vulnerability as long as range increased or speed improved or payload capacity grew. The result was an aircraft that could indeed fly remarkable distances and carry substantial weapons loads, but could not bring its crews home alive when things went wrong. And in war, things always went wrong eventually. Every aircraft got hit. Every crew faced crisis. Every mission encountered the unexpected. Survivability meant having margins, redundancy, protection that gave crews a fighting chance when the shooting started. The G4M had none of those things, and its loss rates proved the cost of that omission. As the team packed up their tools and notes, preparing to brief their commanders on the discoveries, Hayes took one last walk around the captured bomber. In daylight, it looked almost peaceful, a sleek aircraft that might have been beautiful if not for the bullet holes and the knowledge of what lay beneath its skin. He paused at the nose, where the bombardier would have sat, looking down through a greenhouse of windows at the target below, vulnerable to fire from every angle, with nothing but thin plexiglass between him and enemy guns. The bombardier's position might have been the most exposed of all the crew stations, a glass cage attached to the front of a flying fuel tank. Hayes imagined the view from here during a bombing run, watching anti-aircraft fire rising to meet the aircraft, seeing fighters diving to attack, knowing that any hit could turn the bomber into an inferno, and there was nothing anyone could do but press on and hope. The courage required seemed superhuman, yet Japanese bombardiers had done exactly that, had flown into curtains of fire, had held steady over the target even as their aircraft burned around them. Such men deserved better tools than this. The captured G4M would remain at the facility for additional testing, eventually being flown by American pilots to evaluate its handling characteristics and performance. Those test flights would provide valuable intelligence, helping Allied forces understand the aircraft's capabilities and limitations more fully. But the primary lesson had already been learned, documented in the pages of technical reports and tactical bulletins that would circulate through the Pacific theater. The lesson was simple and brutal. The G4M would burn when hit, burned easily, and burned completely, its crews having almost no chance of survival once fire started. American fighter pilots would be instructed to aim for the wings and fuselage, where fuel tanks lurked beneath thin skin. Even modest battle damage to those areas would likely prove fatal to the bomber. It was a vulnerability so fundamental that it bordered on criminal negligence, a flaw that no amount of crew skill or courage could overcome. The captured aircraft had revealed this truth in stark mechanical detail, its exposed fuel lines and unprotected tanks standing as testament to design choices that valued mission performance above all else. Hayes filed his report that morning, documenting every vulnerability discovered during the examination. His conclusions were direct. The G4M represented a grave threat to its own crews, and American pilots should exploit its weaknesses ruthlessly. He recommended that fighter tactics emphasize slashing attacks aimed at the wings, where large fuel tanks offered targets impossible to miss. He noted that even training aircraft armed with lighter weapons could effectively engage G4Ms, as the bomber's thin skin provided little protection against anything larger than small arms fire. His report would be read by intelligence officers and tactical planners, would influence training syllabi and combat doctrine, would shape how the war in the Pacific was fought. But as he signed the document and passed it to Chen for translation and distribution, Hayes found himself thinking not about tactical advantages, but about human costs. Every G4M that burned meant 7 Japanese airmen died, often in agony, trapped in machines their own nation had built inadequately. War demanded such deaths. Strategy required exploiting enemy weaknesses. But Hayes took no joy in the knowledge that his report would make those deaths more frequent. The sun climbed higher over the Pacific airfield, its light harsh and unforgiving, exposing every detail of the captured bomber. Other aircraft roared overhead, American fighters and bombers heading out on morning patrols or returning from night missions. The war continued, massive and impersonal, grinding men and machines into dust across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. The G4M, sitting silent in its hangar, represented just one small piece of that vast conflict, one design flaw among countless factors determining victory and defeat. Yet to Hayes and the men who had examined it, the bomber meant something more, a window into the enemy's thinking, a revelation of values and priorities utterly alien to their own. The aircraft stood as physical evidence that different cultures could reach such divergent conclusions about basic questions like how much crew protection was necessary or whether mission capability justified extreme vulnerability. These differences explained much about why the war was being fought and how it would likely end. A nation that sent its pilots to war in flying lighters was a nation that misunderstood the nature of modern combat, that clung to outdated values unsuited to industrial warfare, that would ultimately pay a terrible price for its miscalculations. The exposed fuel lines would haunt Hayes for years after the war. They became for him a symbol of everything tragic about the Pacific conflict, evidence that brilliant young men on both sides were dying for reasons that transcended individual choice or responsibility. Japanese pilots did not design the G4M or choose its vulnerabilities, yet they paid with their lives for decisions made in distant offices by engineers and officers who never had to sit surrounded by unprotected fuel tanks while enemy fighters attacked. Those pilots were brave, skilled, dedicated, and they deserved aircraft that gave them a fighting chance. Instead, they received bombers that turned them into human sacrifices, tools to be expended in pursuit of strategic objectives their own aircraft made nearly impossible to achieve. The cruelty was almost Shakespearean. Heroes brought low, not by their flaws, but by the flaws of the machines they trusted. Hayes would later participate in combat missions where he shot down G4Ms, would watch them burn and fall, and always he would think of those exposed fuel lines, those thin aluminum tanks, those 7 men who knew they were vulnerable but flew anyway. War created such situations constantly, demanded such sacrifices endlessly, and reduced human beings to statistics and tactical problems. But sometimes, as in that hangar examining that captured bomber, the statistics acquired faces, and the tactical problems revealed their human dimensions, and the weight of it all became almost unbearable. Years afterward, when scholars and historians examined the Pacific War and sought to understand why Japan lost, despite initial advantages and tremendous courage, the G4M would feature prominently in their analyses. The bomber epitomized Japan's fatal miscalculations, its blend of tactical sophistication and strategic blindness, its culture that valued offensive spirit over defensive practicality. A nation capable of building an aircraft with the G4M's range and speed was clearly capable of sophisticated engineering. Yet that same nation failed to grasp that unprotected fuel systems were suicidal in modern combat. This failure stemmed from cultural factors as much as material constraints, from a military philosophy rooted in samurai tradition rather than industrial pragmatism, from a refusal to accept that wars were won through attrition and survival rather than honor and sacrifice. The exposed fuel lines that shocked American investigators were the inevitable result of these cultural choices, physical manifestations of beliefs that proved inadequate to 20th century warfare. By the time captured aircraft revealed these truths, it was too late for Japan to change course, too late to redesign its bombers or retrain its pilots in new philosophies. The nation was locked into patterns established years earlier, committed to approaches that no longer worked but could not be abandoned without admitting fundamental error. So the G4Ms kept flying and kept burning, carrying their crews to deaths that accomplished little beyond demonstrating courage in service of flawed strategy. Continue exploring the quiet contradictions that define humanity's darkest hours, the moments when duty demands sacrifice and honor requires vulnerability, when human beings build machines that doom their operators and cultures create values that guarantee suffering, yet somehow meaning emerges from the tragedy and lessons learned in blood guide future generations toward better choices. The captured G4M sat silent in its hangar, a teacher whose curriculum was written in aluminum and fuel, whose lessons were purchased with thousands of lives, whose legacy would echo through aviation history as warning and testament. The exposed fuel lines gleamed dully in the morning light, waiting to instruct anyone willing to look beyond technical details and grasp the human dimensions of design choices. Anyone willing to understand that every aircraft represents not merely engineering, but philosophy, not simply metal, but meaning, not just machinery, but the values of the people who built it and the culture that deployed it. The bomber had revealed its secrets, but the real revelation was what those secrets said about war and humanity, about the distance between intentions and outcomes, between courage and wisdom, between dying well and surviving to fight another day.